So thank you all for coming. I'm here today. My name is Gabriel Sanchez. I'm a fourth year Asian American Studies major, Education Studies minor. I'm here to introduce a mentor of mine, but also a really close big brother figure in my life, Anthony Ocampo. Just a little background between me and him. 2 years ago, when I was just getting started in research, I had no idea what I wanted to study, what I wanted to do, but I just knew I wanted to study Filipinos. I was like, that's cool. I want to study people that look like me, see like me, and then eventually publish that in the academy. And so Professor Vizcarra, one of my faculty mentors here at UCLA, recommended I talk to Anthony because I had interest in social science. And I emailed Anthony out of nowhere saying, hey, I can't find a dissertation anywhere. Can you just send it to me so I can read it? And he was like, yeah, definitely. And if you want to grab coffee, you and I could definitely talk about a career in sociology. And since then, Anthony has really been there for me. Personally and academically, really supporting me along the way, showing me the ropes, bringing me to conferences and taking me and introducing me to different professors in sociology, showing me his work, showing his peers' work. It's all been such a great experience to work with Anthony because he's been such a nurturing person, and it's really helped me define what I want to do in the future and really helped me with what I'm going to be doing in the fall. So but a little background on Anthony. He actually finished his PhD here in 2011 in sociology at UCLA. What he's actually showing you is a section of his dissertation, which is really about Filipino American identity and the relations it has with Latino identity. And oftentimes in sociology, there's a big focus on the black and white paradigm, and our different immigrant groups identifying with black and white issues or black and white identity. But Anthony's research really focuses on the Latino-Asian paradigm, two of the fastest growing groups in the United States, biggest immigrant populations. And showing this research has really shown that there's more context than what we normally see, and showing a new perspective on race relations in the United States.
So, thanks.
Yeah.
That's pretty much it. Yeah, that's a good summary. I almost feel like Gabriel should do this talk for me because he seems to know everything about the project. Gabriel forgot to mention one important thing. He will be starting his PhD in sociology at Stanford University. So it's going to be really exciting to see one more Filipino in the world of sociology. So looking forward to your career. So I just want to say a few thank yous to people here. Rebecca Epstein has been pivotal in creating the flyers, advertising the talk, somehow getting me on the front page of UCLA's website. Alvaro Huerta was the impetus behind planning this event. He randomly hit me up and was like, hey, you should do a talk for the Chicano Studies Research Center. And I was like, sure. But I'm also happy to have folks from sociology, graduate students, professors in Asian American Studies, professors in Chicano Studies, Victor Bascara, Lucy Burns, Barbara Garland, in particular because for any of you that enter academia or are in the world of academia, you'll learn fairly quickly that studying Filipinos is not the easiest way to get grants or fellowships, and so it leads to a lot of heartache, but these people made the journey all the more worth it because they were the ones who supported me when this project was not going so great. And so I'm, in a lot of ways, I feel incredibly indebted to you. Also thank friends that are here. I have a good friend from college, JC, that's here, who, when he sees this, he's gonna trip out because so much of it parallels my experience when he and I were at Stanford. I was in a Latino fraternity, Gamma Zeta Alpha, with him, and I worked for El Centro Chicano, and so a lot of that work inspired this work today. So without further ado, before I start, I just want to give you a quick outline of what I'm going to be talking about today. First, like all sociology projects, I'm going to start with the research puzzle. As Gabriel mentioned, race has often been thought of through the lens of black-white, but in places like Los Angeles, California, and all over the country, we're starting to see this emerging Asian-Latino racial spectrum that's happening, and it's changing the way people think about race. And it's changing the way that Filipinos, I believe, are thinking about race. And so most of the talk today is going to focus on Filipino racial experiences vis-a-vis Latinos and Asian Americans in Los Angeles. And even though I'm focusing on Filipinos, I want to talk about how Filipinos can teach us something about larger concepts of race in the United States. And just for the sake of knowing it, this is one of the chapters in my ongoing book project that will be hopefully published with Stanford University Press in the next year or so. So before I begin, I want to tell you a quick story of my final year of graduate school, something that happened right here in Haynes Hall. Any of you want to go to graduate school or are in graduate school right now? Raise your hand, or have gone to graduate school? Okay, so maybe about 60% of you. So let me let you in a little secret. Going to graduate school is not the most economically prosperous time in one's life, right? Wow, the things we did. But, and so it's not the economically most prosperous time in one's life, and so you can imagine my excitement when I was walking through Haynes Hall, and I came across this flyer right here. It said, alcohol study. Do you drink regularly? Yes. And are you Asian American? And I thought I just hit the jackpot. It's gonna be the easiest $200 I'll ever make in my life. And so I called up the study coordinator, I gave her my name, my availability, and everything was running smoothly until she asked me, "Sir, what's your ethnicity?" And I said, "I'm Filipino." At which point everything went downhill. She said, "I'm sorry, but you're not eligible for this study because we can only have Chinese, Japanese, and Korean participants." And I asked her why, and she said, "It's because we need a genetically similar sample." And so you can imagine my surprise, because I just spent the last 7 years learning that race was a social construct, not a genetic construct. And for anyone that's taken ethnic studies or history classes, we know that Filipinos were a central part of the creation of the term Asian Americans. So Filipinos, along with Chinese Americans and Japanese American activists, they coalesced to create this term Asian American as an ideological tool to help them secure political, civil, and economic rights that they were denied at the time. And so, since the 1960s, when this term first came into fruition, the term Asian American is something we now take for granted, right? We look at the United States Census, Asian American is just one of those other categories, and it's since expanded to include not just Chinese, Japanese, and Filipinos, but also groups from Southeast Asia as well as the Indian subcontinent. And so for as much as Asian American identity is political in origin, the meaning of it has changed over the past 50 years, especially on the everyday level. So when you talk to people about what it means to be Asian American, they likely aren't going to give you an answer that says Asian Americans about politics, right? They'll say things like being Asian Americans about eating rice, being Asian Americans about taking your shoes off before you walk in the house, being Asian Americans about being from Asia, not surprisingly, right? And so literary scholars have talked about this cultural capital of being Asian American. Sociologists have talked about the cultural membership of Asian American identity. And most recently, political scientists from USC, UCR, and University of Maryland did this national level survey where they asked different Asian ethnicities, do you believe Asians have a common culture? And across the board, over 60+% of them said yes. We believe Asian Americans have a common culture. So herein lies the problem, right? When you create cultural rules for what it means to be Asian American, inevitably there's going to be some groups that are left out. And that becomes all the more clear when you look at survey data that asks about racial identity. So researchers from UCLA, researchers from UC Irvine conducted this survey of second-generation children of immigrants, second-generation Filipinos in Los Angeles. And what they did is that they surveyed the 4 largest groups: Chinese, Korean, Vietnamese, and Filipino. And this is what they found. When presented with the question, what is your racial background? Over 95% of Chinese, Korean, and Vietnamese Americans chose Asian as their racial background, and less than 50% of Filipinos did the same. And the objective of today's talk is to try to explain why. Why is it the case that Filipinos are ambivalent about Asian American racial identity? And so that's going to be my working research question for this talk is, what explains the racial ambivalence of Filipino Americans in Los Angeles? And if they're ambivalent about Asian American identity, what are their panethnic experiences? By panethnic, I mean, what are the sense of we-ness that they have beyond just the Filipino ethnic community? And what does the Filipino racial experience teach us about racial formation in 21st century America, where it's becoming less and less black-white and more multi-ethnic? Most of today's talk is going to focus on the first two questions, but I'm more than happy to answer the last question during Q&A or at the reception. Apparently they're having after this. So when it comes to children of immigrants and trying to understand the concept of identity, we can look at theories of immigration, and most of the work that's been done on race and identity for the children of immigrants falls within this paradigm of assimilation, right? So back in the day, in the early 20th century, mid-20th century, scholars used to argue that immigrant groups and their children would inevitably become part of some middle-class white mainstream. But we all know that after 1965, there have been changes in immigration policy that led to increased racial diversity and socioeconomic diversity of immigrants in this country. So now 80% of immigrants today come from Asia and Latin America, not actually from Europe. And so other scholars have presented this concept of segmented assimilation. So they said, yes, there's going to be some immigrant groups that become incorporated into the white middle class mainstream, but there's going to be some that incubate in their co-ethnic immigrant community, and there are going to be others, if they lack social and economic resources, that will fall into this minority urban underclass. Okay? So people have critiqued this theory because they say it's a little bit too one-directional, it's too one-way, right? So what do immigrants have to bring to the table? And so other sociologists by the name of Richard Alba and Victor Nee came up with this concept of convergence, where they say that the way to think about immigration today is to think about the convergence between immigrants and the American mainstream and how they're creating a new American mainstream. But even with this theory, there's issues with it as well, because both the segmented assimilation theory and convergence theory, they don't do a lot of work that looks at how immigrant groups might be converging or might be incorporated into racial communities. So the assimilation paradigms often focus on ethnicity, ethnic identity as the optimal choice. And convergence mainly looks at how immigrants are converging with the white mainstream. But when it comes to Filipinos, there's this issue where they're kind of experiencing segmented convergence, if I can combine these two concepts, where we have to think about how they're converging with different segments of society. And so in any sociology project, it's important to look at groups where there's variability. And I wanted to look at Filipinos because they had a tremendous amount of racial identity variability. And so the data for this project relies on in-depth interviews of Filipino Americans. I interviewed 85 of them. They were second generation, meaning that their parents came from the Philippines and they were born here or were mostly raised here in the United States. I interviewed both men and women, between young adults between the ages of 21 and 30. Most of them were middle class, identified as middle class, but they had different educational backgrounds. So some Filipinos went to four-year universities like UCLA, some went to graduate school, but others went to community college or didn't go to college at all. And I wanted to make sure that when I interviewed people, I included people with various levels of ethnic involvement. So I just didn't want to interview, say, the president of Samahang Filipino, right? Because I thought I'd get a skewed view. And where I recruited these people is important as well. I wanted to look at these multi-ethnic middle-class neighborhoods. So I focused on Eagle Rock. Anyone from Eagle Rock? No. Carson? There we go. So I did, my interviewees were from Eagle Rock and Carson. And you know, these are both middle-class neighborhoods. The median income is $70,000, well above the national average. But in these neighborhoods, there's no majority ethnic group. So what you find is that in Eagle Rock, it's 25% Asian, 40% or so Latino, and 30% white. And in Carson, the demographics are quite similar: quarter Asian, 35% Latino, except the remaining population is African American. These are residential neighborhoods. These are residential neighborhoods that aren't necessarily ethnic enclaves or ethnoburbs in the same way as Monterey Park or Koreatown, meaning that they are chain stores, mom and pop stores, ethnic businesses, and they were both adjacent to working class neighborhoods, working class Latino neighborhoods, working class black neighborhoods, and that's going to be important a little bit later. Yes. Yeah.
Are you making an analytic distinction between race and ethnic group, or are you using those terms interchangeably?
Race, just to clarify, when I think about race, it's umbrella categories like Asian, Latino, and when I think ethnic group, I'm saying like Filipino, national origin groups. Okay, so yeah, that's a good point of clarification. Thanks for asking. And of course, I wanted to situate these qualitative findings within larger surveys of Asian Americans in Los Angeles. So what I did is I also included survey data from this immigrant and intergenerational mobility in metropolitan Los Angeles survey. I'll call it the IMLA from this point on. And here I looked at the immigrant second generation who are of Asian American descent. There are about 1,600 Asian Americans evenly divided between Chinese, Korean, Vietnamese, and Filipino. And so I felt like the way I did this research, it has a lot of theoretical leverage when it comes to thinking about identity and race in particular, as Lauren noted. Because in these multi-ethnic middle-class neighborhoods, it's an emerging context of reception that hasn't been looked at too deeply by existing theories of assimilation. Research on middle-class Black communities shows that the middle-class minority segment is really creative with the way they think about their identity options. And this gives me an opportunity to look at racial agency as opposed to racial stigmatization. Other than that, again, I wanted to play with the strengths of those theories and think about how Filipinos are converging with different segments of society. And of course, in Los Angeles, where I have this emerging Latino population, it's a great way to look at the effects of the Latinization of American society. So Tomas Jimenez, the sociologist at Stanford, talks about this concept of replenishment and how Mexican immigration is replenishing Mexican identity for those that were born here. And what I want to do is kind of extend that concept and say that Mexican immigration or Latino immigration is replenishing the Latino aspects of Filipino identity in places like Los Angeles. So now to the findings, the important part, the story. So again, the point of this conversation today is to try to explain what's going on here. Why do Filipinos have a sense of ambivalence about Asian American identity? And when I went throughout the conversations, what I was finding is that Filipinos tended to situate themselves, that says Filipino down there, just in case you can't see. Filipinos tend to situate themselves somewhere between Asians and Latinos. So there were certain life moments where they felt a sense of we-ness with Asian Americans, and there were other life moments where they felt a sense of we-ness with Latinos. And today I'm going to focus on the latter because I think this is a story that hasn't really been flushed out in sociological research. And so, why do Filipinos identify with Latinos? I'm going to try to give you a quick 30-second history of the Philippines. And I'll do it with this catchphrase that we hear in the Philippines all the time. There's this saying that Filipinos spent 300 years in the convent and 50 years in Hollywood, right? And it's this idea that 300 plus years of Spanish colonialism left all these cultural residuals like Spanish in the Tagalog language, Catholicism, the religious landscape of the Philippines looks much more like Latin America, and Filipinos have Spanish last names like Ocampo, Rodriguez, Torres. And with the United States came in, made English the medium language of instruction, made English a national language, and for anyone that's familiar with Filipino society, we know that the Americans have had a tremendous influence on Filipino pop culture, even today. And so culture matters. And why does culture matter when it comes to race? The reason culture matters when it comes to race is that when everyday people think about racial identity, they often think of it through the lens of culture. So what they'll do is that they'll think of race kind of like as a constellation of different factors. So yes, race has to do with what you look like, that's phenotype, but race is also a matter of what language you speak or how you speak your language. It's also a matter of cultural knowledge, it's a matter of social networks, it's a matter of religion, it's a matter of behavior. And all these things kind of work in conjunction with each other to draw you a picture of racial identity. So in the same way we can't just look at this one star right here and say that's the Big Dipper, we have to look at everything together, and that's when we can conclude this is the big or one of the dippers. I don't know which one, but it's one of the dippers. So I found when you change the question, so instead of like in a survey where you ask, what's your racial background, you change the question, you say, which group are you closest to, right? People that have looked at identity and we-ness and panethnicity ask this question, which group do you feel closest to? And herein started to emerge the answer. So I was talking to Leah. Leah's a 22-year-old college, she's not in college anymore, but when I interviewed her, she was in college, and she's from Carson, California. And I asked her, which group are you closest to? And she said, well, it's hard to consider Filipinos as Asian because we're the only Asian country that was colonized by Spain for 300 years. We're more Latin. We have more similarities with Latino culture than Asian culture. And what she said next is something I heard over and over again from Filipinos as well as Latinos. She said, Filipinos are the Mexicans of Asia. And so taking this racial catchphrase as a symptom of Filipinos' racial position in the United States, it denotes a lot of things, right? The Mexicans of Asia is the phrase they would use because we're in Los Angeles, right? It denotes cultural hybridity. There's some hybridity with Filipino culture. It denotes the colonial history. It denotes intragroup hierarchy, this idea that Filipinos within the larger Asian umbrella are somewhere there, but not necessarily the Asian Americans. And it denotes racial invisibility, right? They needed to qualify themselves as the Mexicans or the Latinos of Asia because people didn't get it when they would say things like, I'm Asian, right? They didn't get some of the cultural things that were going on with these people. And just to note, it wasn't just Filipinos that felt this way, as I mentioned. Latinos felt this way as well, especially in these neighborhoods. And so one very famous Latino by the name of Junot Diaz, he's had a lot of quotes in the media where he's visited the Philippines or talked about the Philippines. He didn't grow up in LA, he grew up in Jersey City, in a Dominican Filipino area. And he said this when he visited the Philippines and about his life in Jersey City. He said to a Filipino reporter, he said, you should come to the Dominican Republic because from what I've seen so far, Filipinos would have no problem over there. We have certain strong similarities. Our countries have been colonized by Spain, both the Spanish and the Americans. I feel the similarities very strongly. And that sense of feeling the similarities is important because, again, race is something that can happen in an instant. So for today, I'm going to focus on 4 particular aspects of racial identity that came up in the interviews. I'm going to focus on phenotype, language, religion, and social networks because these were the 4 arenas where Filipinos displayed the most the strongest sense of ambivalence about Asian American identity, and these were the same 4 arenas where they displayed a sense of closeness with Latinos. And so to start, I'll be talking about phenotype. So again, phenotype, it's what you look like, it's what your skin color is, and when Filipinos talked about how they fit within different racial categories, they would say things like, well, we're not really Asian because we're too dark-skinned, right? Or we're not really Asian because we don't have slanted eyes. A lot of them refer to phenotype, as problematically as it is, right? They refer to phenotype. And what I found is that there are a lot of Filipinos where in their lives it was as common for them to be racialized, that is perceived as Latino, as it was for them to be perceived as Asian, depending on where they were. So Filipinos spoke about being mistaken as Mexican, Central American, even Puerto Rican, depending on where they were at. And some spoke about being seen as Chinese, Korean, and Vietnamese. And there was one young woman who talked about, well, it depends on what part of LA I'm at. If I'm in Koreatown, people will think I'm Asian, but if I'm in East LA, people will assume I'm Mexican, right? And so, again, it all depended. And so Angie, she's a saleswoman that I met in Eagle Rock. When I talked to her about how she thought about her identity, she said, you know, there's some Filipinos who have Chinese blood, and they have more of that Asian look. I guess it's more convenient for them to say they're Asian because others can't tell. But me, I don't look Japanese or Chinese, so I can't do that. So when you look at Angie's narrative, here she has this sense that because her phenotype didn't fit larger conceptions of what it means to be Asian, she felt a less legitimate part of the Asian American category. Caesar, who grew up in Carson, he was one of those people that said, well, it depends on what part of town I'm in, right? When he talked about identity, he said, well, if we're in a Hispanic place, people assume I'm Mexican. It happens to Filipinos a lot, especially to my cousin. He just looks Mexican, but he's Filipino. We both have that Spanish influence, we both have that Spanish blood. Sometimes we look Hispanic or Latino. And what's funny about Caesar's statement is if you actually look in history, there wasn't a whole lot of racial mixing in the Philippines. This is just some narrative that's been perpetuated within Filipino communities that Filipinos have Spanish blood. But if you compare them to, say, Puerto Rico or Mexico, there wasn't the same extent of racial mixing in the Philippines. So it's interesting that here Caesar's using genealogy as a way to qualify what's happening to him vis-a-vis Latinos and Asians in Los Angeles. So in some senses, you could kind of think of what's happening with Caesar as like he's a racial chameleon, right? So what color he is depends largely on the social context surrounding him. So the second thing I want to talk about is language. And here I'm not just talking about language itself, like Spanish, Tagalog, German. I'm also talking about language experiences, because I think they played a big role in why Filipinos felt a sense of distance from Asians, but also felt a sense of closeness with Latinos, right? When we think about language and the everyday type of words that Filipinos would hear, and when they would hear people speak Spanish, what happened is that they started to compare the two languages. So Filipinos and some of the Latinos that I encountered, they say things like, well, Tagalog and Spanish aren't exactly the same, but you can catch the gist of what each other's saying. And just being able to catch the gist, being able to identify these common words, was enough for them to build a sense of solidarity with Latinos. So they would say like, oh, we have lots of everyday words in Tagalog that are the same in Spanish. So words like table, fork, spoon, food items you would hear on an everyday basis are the same. Mesa, tenedor, cuchara. Days of the week are the same in Tagalog and Spanish. Lunes, martes, miércoles. Clothing items like pantalones, camiseta, zapatos. And everyday activities like work. Trabajo is the same in both Spanish and Tagalog. Merienda means snack in both Tagalog and Spanish. And so, again, language matters because people use language to make determinants about whether people are authentically part of a racial group. You can just think of the Fresh Prince of Bel-Air, then think of Carlton, right? Or when people say things like, oh, they're not really Mexican, what they're actually trying to say is they don't speak Spanish, right? And so when it comes to language, part of language also has to do with names, right? Names play a big part in how people are categorized. We know that names help signal certain qualifications about people. There's been studies done of resumes where people make assumptions about people's work abilities based on their name. And the same thing can happen with Filipinos when it comes to race. And so Filipinos also said things like, oh, you know, if you look at Filipino last names like Alvarado, De La Cruz, Gonzalez, Gutierrez, those don't sound like typical Asian last names like Chang, Chin, Cho, Win. These are the sort of things that Filipinos would say. And they would say, well, you know, everyone seemed to have a Latino friend that had a last name that was just like theirs. And so they said, Filipino last names, Filipinos are kind of like Latinos because they have Latino last names like Alvarado, De La Cruz, Gonzalez. Same sort of thing going on here. In fact, when I teach at Cal Poly Pomona, and 60+% of the students are Latino, and it's about the 4th or 5th week where students realize that I'm not Mexican, because when they register for class, they see Ocampo and they assume, oh, our professor's Mexican, and they get excited. And then I blow their dreams. So, anyway. So again, part of language has to do with experience, right? And one of the quintessential things that when you think about Asian American identity is how often people associate that with bilingualism or biculturalism. And the language patterns, if you look at the Asian Americans in Los Angeles, particularly second generation Asian Americans, I'm going to turn again to that INLA survey. This tells you a story about language and identity. So what I'm going to show you is a graph, pretty simple graph, where I'm going to show you the proportion of mothers who speak English well, the proportion of percentage of fathers that speak English well, and the percentage of second generation Asians that grew up in bilingual households. Okay, so the first bar, which is green, will be mothers, second bar is orange, that'll be fathers, and yellow, the third bar will be bilingual households. Okay, so with Chinese Americans, you find that with second generation Chinese, about 50% of their mothers and 60% of their fathers speak English well, and 90% of them grew up in bilingual households. And you find the same pattern going on with Koreans and Vietnamese. But when you look at Filipinos, the patterns are actually reversed. 90% of Filipino mothers and fathers speak English well or very well. In fact, about 80% of Filipinos said their parents speak English very well. And only 50% of them grew up in bilingual households where they spoke English and Tagalog or English and Ilocano. And this matters, right? This bar matters here because what I found when you do like a chi-square test, it's a statistical test to test for different. What I found is that Filipinos who grew up bilingual were significantly more likely to choose Asian as their racial background. And so Jen, when I talked to Jen, her story kind of personified what was going on here. So Jen, like many college students, took a class and she wanted to explore her identity, so she took an Intro to Asian American Studies class. And on the first day of class, the professor had the students go around and say, what does it mean to be Asian American identity? And so she was trying to see what the experiences were. When Jen would listen to the stories of her other Asian American peers, she started to get uncomfortable. She said, I felt like there was a difference between those who were Chinese, Korean, and those who were Filipino. It just felt different. I think because a lot of the Asian American experiences that we read about in our class talked about language. The other Asians would talk about their parents only being able to speak Mandarin or Vietnamese and having to be the mediator. That was the Asian American experience. But I felt that wasn't the case for me. My parents speak English just fine, right? So again, here, because Jen didn't grow up bilingual, she felt less authentic as an Asian American in an Asian American studies class, which ironically, as sociologists have argued, is meant to foster Asian American identity in the first place. So it's interesting that in an Asian American studies space, this was the space where Jen was feeling least Asian. Yes?
For those 4 ethnic groups, were the parents in the U.S. for the same amount of time?
I didn't look at the differences in how long the parents were, but I think it would be fair to assume that most of them came after 1965. So most Asian Americans in LA are post-65. So I would, with the Filipinos, they're the only ones where I actually looked at differences in time in the U.S. and most of them came in the early 80s, late 70s. So they would have been here about 20-some years. So, but that's a good question. It's a good question. So again, when we think about race, again, it's a constellation of factors that come into play, and one of them is religion, right? So religion makes a big deal, and when Filipinos talked about how they fit vis-a-vis other racial groups, they always mention religion. When you look at the Philippines, about 80% of the Philippines is Catholic, 80% of Filipino immigrants are Catholic, and those numbers parallel places like Mexico, Latin America. In fact, most of the sending countries of the United States, most of the Asian sending countries, you're not going to find a country where the percentage of Catholics exceeds 10%. And even in the United States, the second largest group is Vietnamese, and Vietnamese are only about 30% Catholic. And so you could see that with Filipinos, there's this, even though there are a lot of Protestant Filipinos, there's primordial link between Filipino identity and Catholicism, and that's something that they found to be parallel to that of Latinos. And so when I asked individuals, which group do you feel closest to again? This is where they would use religion as their qualifier. So Inez, I talked to her and asked that question, and she said, definitely Latinos. A lot of that strict Catholicism stuff. My parents were very into having saints and the Virgin Mary in our house, and that's just like Latinos. There's a lot of culture and religion intermingled. That's a big similarity. And again, stuff like this, these observations were possible because of the particular neighborhoods where Filipinos lived, where they lived alongside Latinos. Alma from Carson, she said, when you hear Filipino or Latino, you think Catholic automatically. I don't think of religion when I think of Asians, or if I do, maybe I'll think of Buddha but not Jesus or Mary. And so with what's interesting about Almas, you see how Almas, because of their neighborhoods, right? In these two neighborhoods, Eagle Rock and Carson, with that Asian American population, Filipinos constitute about 80+% of that group. And so growing up, a lot of them said they didn't really have day-to-day contact with other Asian Americans, and so their perceptions of Asian American identity were based largely on stereotypes. Obviously, there's a lot of Asian Christians, Korean Christians, Chinese Christians, but a statement like this, maybe I think of Buddha but not Jesus or Mary, shows how strong these Orientalist perceptions of Asian American identity are still persistent, not just with whites, but with other minority groups as well. And so what's interesting about neighborhood space and religion is that religion also gave Filipinos this increased opportunity to have encounters, day-to-day interactions, where these cultural similarities became more salient. So when I was at a church carnival in Eagle Rock, at one of the parishes, I was at a church carnival, I was just hanging out, eating spaghetti with hot dog in it or something like that. And sitting next to me was a Latino gentleman by the name of Antonio. And Antonio was just sitting there and we struck up a conversation. And in his hand, he had these green stems right here. Pitayas, right? Pitayas. He had these green stems and I asked him what those were, and he said these are pitayas, or dragon fruit in English. And so I asked him what happened, and he said, where'd he get them? Because, I was like, it's unusual, he's just carrying pitayas stems. He said he bought them, someone was selling them at the carnival, and he purchased them. And when he said he purchased them, he was surprised because a Filipino gentleman approached him, and he said, hey, you gotta make sure you plant those 15 inches apart from each other or they won't grow. And Antonio told me, he said, how did this guy know what pitayas were? How did he know how to grow them? Because for Antonio, he associated pitayas with Latino culture, right? He said, I thought they were just a Latino thing. And so here you start to see how Antonio's conceptions of what it means to be Latino and what it means to be Filipino start to converge a little bit, because a Filipino man knew something that he thought was inherently knowledge that only Latinos would know. Later on, an older woman who was limping approached Antonio and asked him, are those nopales? And he was very clear that the Filipino woman asked him, are those nopales? She didn't say cactus. And so that surprised him because she spoke Spanish. And then Antonio said that the woman said, oh, because if you drink nopales, it's really good for uric acid buildup, because the woman had gout. And so Antonio was saying, I feel like that's one of those home remedies that my tia or my abuela would have shared that you wouldn't hear from the doctor. So again, you see these sort of silly kind of stories that happen where people in people's minds, they start to see that Filipinos and Latinos are quite similar. And as I've shared this work in different places, people have always said things like, "Oh my God, I've always thought that," or I've always told my Filipino, like Latinos will say, "I've always told my Filipino friend that she's really Mexican because she really is," So all of these cultural factors, religion, language, and even phenotype to an extent, they matter. They matter in terms of how Filipinos build social networks. So Filipinos talk a lot about going to Latino environments and being able to blend into the landscape. And I'll give anyone $1, they can guess which one of these people is actually the Filipino one. So they talked about going to like Latino parties, kickbacks, any guesses?
On the right.
Kickbacks, barbecues, things like quinceañeras, etc., etc. And when they would go, people wouldn't notice their presence. The unnewsworthiness was what was newsworthy to me. Because I heard people say, like, and I've spoken to Latinos about this as well, they say, oh, with my Filipino friends, I just introduced them. This is my friend, Jennifer. But if it was a Chinese person, they would say, this is my Chinese friend, Ashley. And with Filipinos, they didn't do that. And so in my head, I was like, that's meaningful, because the fact that they didn't mark them as different kind of signals that they kind of blended in. And so I have a bunch of stories for that if anyone wants to hear them. But when it comes to race and social networks, one of the things that sociologists have creatively done is they've used intermarriage as a measure of racial closeness. So Michael Rosenfeld at Stanford has talked about how people tend, even if they don't marry someone of the same ethnicity, they tend to marry someone of the same larger panethnic or racial category. So let me show you the intermarriage patterns of Asian Americans in Los Angeles. Okay? So again, we have Chinese, Korean, Vietnamese, and Filipino. When Filipinos don't marry other Filipinos, about 1 in 5 will marry someone who's Latino. 20% of Filipinos will marry someone who's Latino. And I've seen this same pattern in other surveys. There's a survey based in San Diego called the Children of Immigrants Longitudinal Study, and Filipinos, 25% of the Filipinos in that survey married someone who's of Latino descent. In fact, Filipinos were only 10%. If you compare it to other Asian American groups, less than 3% of other Asian American groups marry someone who's Latino. And with Filipinos, only about 10% of them marry someone who's of another Asian ethnicity. And this same pattern held up when I just casually looked at the San Diego data, which is a racial context that's very similar to LA. And so, what's going on here? I think this story from one of the gentlemen I interviewed, Marlon. Marlon, when he talked about, during his interview, he talked a lot about dating, right? He's kind of this like self-proclaimed ladies man, and Mac Daddy type. And he would talk about the women that he dated, and he was speaking about the woman he was dating currently. And he said, I'm kind of nervous about the girl I'm dating. She's Vietnamese, So this is the first time I'm dating someone from a different race. So why was this interesting to me? This was interesting because he had just spent the last half hour talking about his 2 previous girlfriends, both of whom were Mexican. And he didn't say anything about that. And I said, well, what about those 2 other women you dated? Aren't they of a different race? And he says, that doesn't count. Mexicans are the same as Filipinos. And so these sort of statements, again, I found these to be socially meaningful because there was this sense of we-ness that was invoked from Filipinos. And as I presented this research, I found more and more also invoked by Latinos that grew up around Filipinos in places like Mira Mesa, like different parts of Los Angeles, San Jose, for example. I thought Union City, right? Union City. And so what I was trying to show is that when it comes to trying to understand the racial ambivalence of Filipino Americans, culture matters and history matters, right? Even though Filipinos, not all of them had a strong sense of history, the cultural residuals of their colonial history was present in their everyday lives. And it was something that they used to build, they were the building blocks of their relationships with Latinos that they lived with in the neighborhood. And so colonialism mattered, right? And colonialism mattered in a very different way than it did, say, more than a century, or about half a century ago, with the United Farm Workers, where colonialism and colonial policies helped funnel Filipinos and Mexicans into the same agricultural labor market. That's not necessarily what's going on today, right? Most Filipinos today are highly skilled migrants, professionals, nurses. And so what's interesting is that this type of colonial panethnicity, as I call it in the book project, it occurred with Filipinos and Latinos even if they were of different socioeconomic backgrounds. Colonial panethnicity. And what I found is that it emerged mostly in what I call intimate contexts. Things like family relationships, friend relationships, neighborhood relationships, church, places where that people tend to associate with their personal lives. What was interesting, again, remember I said earlier that Eagle Rock and Carson were adjacent to working class neighborhoods, predominantly Latino working class neighborhoods. And what I found is that in those places, colonial panethnicity didn't really happen as much, right? It broke down where Latinos were policed or negatively racialized. And the best example of this I can give you is with one gentleman named Jason, who I call Jason. When he would hang out with his Mexican friends from Eagle Rock, his mom was cool with it, but when he hung out with his Mexican friends from Highland Park, the adjacent working class neighborhood, all of a sudden he had a curfew, you know? So when it came to Latinos being policed, this is where Filipinos, situations where they're policed, this is where Filipinos, I noticed, start to have more of social distance with Latinos. So I don't want to valorize this Filipino-Latino connection as something that everybody feels or it happens all the time. And one of the places that Latino identity was policed most was actually in public schools, right? So in public schools, because of the school tracking system, where schools tracking systems are also racially stratified, and we have Asians at the AP and honors classes and Latinos and other minorities in the regular classes, and people in the regular classes are very heavily policed by teachers and counselors, even policemen that are sometimes on campus. And what I found is that Filipinos in these contexts developed a sense of panethnicity with Asian Americans, because within the context of the public school system, they fit what their conception of what Asian American was in that particular environment. So in the neighborhood, while Asian can mean, one thing, in the school context for them, Asian meant model minority, unfortunately. And so because Filipinos were the ones who were in the AP and honors classes, they were like, well, we're the ones doing well, so in Eagle Rock and Carson, we're like the Asian ones, since Asians aren't here in the neighborhood. They said they would use Asian as a descriptor for the good kids or the smart kids when talking about their experiences in high school. Of course, once they went to UCLA and Berkeley, where Filipinos are underrepresented, that all went away, right? So, and I'm sure the Samahang Filipino contingent can attest to this, where Filipinos' educational experiences actually mirror those of Latinos and African Americans on a campus like UCLA. So anyway, what does this teach us about racial formation in 21st century America? Well, it teaches us that when it comes to Asian American racialization, colonialism matters, right? But most people talk about colonialism and how it matters with respect to Filipinos or groups' relationship with whites. What I'm trying to show here is that we can operationalize colonialism and see it present in everyday life. And it affects inter-ethnic relations. It affects how Filipinos develop a sense of we-ness or closeness with other immigrant groups, other racial groups, particularly Asians and Latinos. This also illustrates what I think Michael Omi and Howard Winant, these two sociologists, say is the instability of racial categories. Racial categories are constantly evolving. Christina Mora at UC Berkeley just talked about how this term Hispanic is something that just emerged in the 1960s, but even though we think of it as like a term that is real and has existed for the history of time, it actually hasn't. What I try to show is that panethnic categories, they resonate to different degrees because of the instability of racial categories. Again, I wanted to sort of hint that there's strengths to many different paradigms in assimilation theory, or so we should think about how immigrants and their children are converging with different segments of society, particularly as our societies become more and more multi-ethnic and less black-white. And here we have to think about how historical factors interact with racial contexts on an everyday basis and what that does for identity, and how the rules of race change depending on whether we're in the neighborhood or whether we're at school or whether we're at the workplace. And so finally, I think that I just want to signal that what I'm trying to show here is that there's a possibility of these new panethnic experiences in a multi-ethnic society, right? But most of you know that Typhoon Haiyan occurred in the Philippines. And actually one of the interesting articles that I caught in La Opinion talked about how to rally Latino support. And in that article, what they did was they invoked the shared colonial history of Mexico and the Philippines to try to galvanize support from Latino readers. And so again, the possibility of new panethnic experiences, identity experiences that are not just based here in the US, but are also influenced by the culture that people bring with them upon arrival in the United States. So with that, I want to close and welcome any questions that you might have. Thank you. I solved everything, apparently. Just kidding. Neil.
I'll just kick it off.
Yeah.
I really enjoyed this, so thank you for the presentation. I'm curious about how much race is experienced by like your interview subjects as something that's happened to them versus something that they can actively like choose identity categories at different moments, right? And so I think the term that's going through my head that I didn't hear was passing, right? So in some cases, it's an instrumental thing to do to pass as Asian, right? I'm trying to get this job. I want this teacher to not track me in the sort of like bad category. I want to go in the good category.
Yeah.
And other times, you know, being Asian is too nerdy, so you put on your Latino face. Or is it something that happens to people as opposed to something they can actively choose?
It's a dialectic, right? And so with race, it's what I definitely want to say is that with these individuals, most of whom weren't, say, well versed in the research on race, right, or ethnic studies, is that they weren't necessarily instrumental all the time. Like, oh, this is a Latino context, I'm going to play down my Asianness and wear a shirt that says Rodriguez on my back or something. It wasn't as instrumental, but the moments of passing, I think, are important. Could you? I want to know that I'm getting your question right. Could you repeat it again?
Sure. I'm wondering, if any of them said anything more along the lines of, you know, I do actively downplay my Asianness in some settings in order to fit in better. In others, I know that it'll be to my benefit to play up the Asianness. And whether they have a sense of that they're doing that or that it's something that just sort of happens.
Yeah, what was interesting is that I didn't come across, like, of the people I interviewed, they neither had strong, fervent ascriptions to Asian American identity or Latino. Like, they never said, I'm Latino or I'm Asian American. When you ask them, you know, if you ask them what's your race, they'll say Filipino, right? That's the stock answer. The time I saw this happen most had to do with school situations. So a lot of Filipinos that were moving along in higher education started to figure out that if you say Asian, it's to your disadvantage. And so some of them were like, when I applied to grad school, I put myself as Pacific Islander to signal the fact that Filipinos are underrepresented. So that was the thing that I saw. But with that said, a lot of Filipinos identified as Pacific Islander, but when you ask them what does that mean, they're like, because we're islands in the Pacific, right? And so it wasn't something that had the same signification as, say, folks from Samoa, Guam, or Tongans. So they strategically flip-flop between those two. Yes?
I thought this topic was very interesting because I grew up in Daly City.
Daly City.
Yeah, and so in school, like the Filipinos didn't really, from what I experienced, they didn't see themselves as like Latino. They just saw them, or Asian sometimes. They saw themselves as just like Filipino. And from my experience, I guess phenotypically I look more Asian, and so my teachers would be like, "Oh, are you Chinese?" I was like, "No, I'm Filipino." And then one of my teachers would comment like, "Just say you're Chinese." Like it was weird.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Did you just say you're Chinese after that?
No, like I would just say I was like I'm Filipino, but then even here they're like, but you're not dark, so I'd have to like rationalize it as like why I'm not dark too.
So it's interesting because the problematic construction of Asian American identity is actually affecting like how authentic Filipinos feel with other Filipinos. So that's an interesting thing to point out. With Daly City is like the one major city where Filipinos number like over 30%. There's not really many places out there that it's like that. And so I think Daly City is an interesting place because it doesn't have the same degree of Latino presence. And what I was trying to show is that people do with what they got, right? So in Los Angeles, Latino has a meaning, right? And Asian has a meaning. And what I'm showing here is that in Eagle Rock and Carson, Latino has a very multi-dimensional meaning, and in those neighborhoods, Asian is very stereotypical in nature, and so they're grappling with, even though they don't have the same knowledge base about those two categories, they're grappling with it in the same way. So, but Daly City is an interesting case because in the Bay, I didn't see this as much in say San Francisco, but I saw it in Union City and San Jose. So context matters, right? Do you have a question?
Yes. So do you actually examine the similarity within other type of Asian versus East Asian side, Filipino versus Southeast Asian in terms of phenotype, or even I saw some research study on like Cambodian students that they would classify themselves as non-Pan Asian because of their academic performance or something in high school. So almost similar to your finding.
Yeah.
Do you see any connections with the other?
So this San Diego-based survey, right, the Children of Immigrants longitudinal study, what was interesting in LA is that it looked at Chinese, Korean, and Vietnamese. In San Diego, it looked at Filipino, Laotian, Hmong, Vietnamese. And what they found is that with Filipinos, they were the least likely to choose Asian again. So it was about 60% instead of 40%. But with Hmong, Vietnamese, and what did I miss? Laotian. 90% of them chose Asian when they had a checkbox. And so I think what's unique about Filipinos is that geography thing matters because they were islands and they know that they're islands because there's 7,000 of them, right? And it's a very salient thing in their mind. And so Pacific Islander kind of made sense in ways that might not make the same sense or as options for the Southeast Asian contingent. I'm not as...
Who are these people being surveyed? Are they students or just adults?
Oh, in San Diego?
Yeah.
They surveyed these students starting in 7th and 8th grade. They re-surveyed them when they were about 15 years old, and most recently surveyed them when they were in their mid-20s. So they followed them from childhood to young adulthood. So, but that's a great question. When it comes to education, that's where Southeast Asians really start to feel that stigma of not really feeling Asian, because as you know, Hmong, Laotians, they don't have the same educational attainment levels, anything close to other age groups, including Filipinos. So, yeah, you had your hand up earlier.
Yeah, I find it interesting that you mentioned that Filipinas, they sometimes identify more as Latino. I myself was a Latino. Growing up in Union City, where there was a lot of Filipinas in my community, I sometimes identified more as Filipino sometimes, just because like Latinos in my community are very policed, and I was on the track towards receiving a higher education. People in my community weren't, so I know that's problematic, but I'm more conscious of that now, and it's very interesting because there are a lot of similarities between our two communities.
Yeah, Union City. It's the Asian population there is mostly Filipino, right? Across the Dumbarton Bridge.
Yeah.
Yeah, I've done other research studies where the Latino that was moving toward higher education, or was moving toward higher education and was going to a school where Latinos were heavily policed. I've heard that, like, in San Gabriel Valley, I can think of someone in particular who talked about how he was Asian in high school, right? And so your ascription to Filipino-ness might be specific to their position in the educational spectrum in Logan High School.
Yeah.
Logan High School, right? And so being Filipino might be associated with those characteristics that you so wanted to ascribe to, whereas in your local context, which you now know is somewhat problematic, right?
Yeah.
Being Latino was pretty one-dimensional, and it was seen as something that was not associated with your life goals. So socially and personally, I could see how that might have happened. So, Cesar?
Yeah. So I love your talk, first of all, and your theorization of colonialism and its importance. But I have a question about 20th century colonialism. Colonialism here means the common Hispanic past, but Filipinos have a common colonial history with Puerto Ricans, for example, and they were unincorporated territories of the U.S. and so on and so forth. I know that that's not so much in California, but maybe in Hawaii you will find communities of Filipinos and Puerto Ricans who were both plantation workers there and so on. One group of them got U.S. citizenship, the Puerto Ricans. One group didn't, the Filipinos, for racist law. So my question about colonialism is, what you're talking about now are recent immigrants that came to America at a time when legal racial classifications had kind of disappeared. We're in a sort of, there isn't anything in the code that says you're Filipino, you cannot buy a house in this neighborhood or what. That's gone, right, since the 60s. So they came into that world, but how much of the categories that they are facing were built by U.S. colonialism beforehand, and how alive are they? So, for instance, Baldos in his book about Filipinos, shows a case where people are trying to acquire U.S. citizenship in California.
Yeah.
And the courts were applying the Chinese exclusion laws to Filipinos. The plaintiffs got an anthropologist from UCLA to testify to the court that the Filipinos were the Malay race, not the Mongolian race. Yeah. Therefore, the statute didn't apply to them, and the court was convinced, and they granted citizenship to the plaintiff. There's an epoch where being Chinese wasn't so cool as it is now, right? Because the state had branded people. How much of that is alive, or has that completely disappeared? How much of the consciousness of Filipinos with respect to other Latinos in the empire? Let's say, unfortunately, there aren't coexisting communities of Puerto Ricans and Filipinos here, but
from the Puerto Rican Filipino situation?
Yeah, well, because the U.S. state decided these guys we're going to give U.S. citizenship to. Those guys we're not going to give U.S. citizenship to in 1917. Yeah. And they made up till then they had the same status.
That's a great question. So with the situation of colonialism, right, in 1917, the Jones Act, this is where Filipinos and Puerto Ricans parted ways, right?
Right.
And if you look at the congressional records of how people talked about Puerto Ricans, it was somewhat more favorable, right? They're more I'm thinking of Jose Cabranes, 1979, but
right.
They're more European, they're more like us, let's grant them citizenship. Filipinos are not anything close to us, let's not grant them citizenship, let's call them nationals so that we can still control them and have them work for us, but we don't have to give them no benefits, right? And so with respect to what's happening in places where there are both Filipinos and Puerto Ricans, like Jersey City is a good example, right? What I think colonialism did is that it created a institutional context in the Philippines, the U.S. educational system, where these native Filipinos would go to school, they would become accustomed to American ways of life. They could get degrees in nursing, which were something that happened to be needed in the 1960s, moved to a place like New Jersey, and everything was hunky-dory. With Puerto Ricans, because they've had like citizenship this wole time, the selectivity of Puerto Ricans is I mean, you need
Negative, actually.
it's negative, right? So you need like $100 to get here, and that's
And
all
I
you
cousin
need.
in Brooklyn, yeah.
Yeah, and that's all you need. And so there's a huge class disparity between Puerto Ricans and Philippines that I think might deter this same type of alliance that's going on with Filipinos and Mexicans. And to allude to the earlier story I said about Jason, in Eagle Rock and in Carson, the Mexican Americans, mostly Mexican Americans that Filipinos would encounter, were upwardly mobile or solidly middle class Latinos, right? And so these were, as some respondents said, these are the church-going Latinos. These weren't the stereotypically cholo-looking Latinos, right? And so because in Los Angeles there's enough class heterogeneity among Latinos where there's a little bit of convergence between Filipinos and Latinos in these spaces, I think that these things are possible. In a place like New York, where the selectivity of Filipino migrants, I think, is much higher than it is in California. Maybe it's distance, maybe it's history, and the Puerto Rican selectivity, as you know, is negative. That's not the best formula for Filipinos and Puerto Ricans.
So they're not in the same class spaces. They're
Not in the same class spaces. With that said, on occasion, I have come across East Coast Filipinos that have said, oh, you know, like, I dated a Puerto Rican. But what's interesting is that the other places I see this happen most prevalent are Filipinos from Austin, Texas, or Texas, where again, you have a great class diversity of Mexican Americans, and so there's the possibility of both cultural and class convergence that makes these stories possible. Yes?
So first of all, thank you. This was super interesting. So going along the same lines of like cultural hybridity, I was wondering if anywhere in your interviews, if people use the term like honorary Latino, or if that concept came up at all in your data?
Definitely, right? This is how it came up most often. Filipinos would be with their Latino friends. Latinos would talk shit about Asians, and then the Filipino would be like, and the Latino would the Filipino would not actually be offended, but was intrigued more so. And the Latino would say, oh, you don't count, you guys are basically Latino or honorary Latino. That's where I heard the story happen the most. So, yes.
And you mentioned this earlier, but how does this impact the white-black paradigm that it's been so prevalent here in America?
How does this impact the white-black paradigm? I think when you think about material outcomes like getting a job, right, or running for office, that's where I think it's going to matter, right? Because in places like California, you have areas like the San Gabriel Valley, you have places like Carson, you have places in Northeast Los Angeles, San Fernando Valley, where the identities of cachet are less and less black-white and more Asian Latino. The idea that you can galvanize this large, booming community and arguably economy, like clientele or political constituents, it makes black-white less relevant for these individuals. What's funny is that when Filipinos do travel to black-white areas, this is where things totally go awry. And most commonly, the Filipinos that go to places that are black-white, people will assume they're Chinese or Mexican. But in LA, I think that the cachet of these other racial categories, Asian, Latino, is emerging so quickly since the 1970s, 80s, 90s, that there's not as much of a need to say, like, be dependent on that, fitting into that black-white racial binary. And you know, other people like I mentioned Tomas Jimenez and his work in like the South Bay, like Cupertino and San Jose, he's showing that the ethno-racial hierarchies are kind of changing so that they're not so white-centric, if you will, but incorporating a now Asian-centric concept of merit, for example. So, oh, okay. Yes, USC. Wait, is that a USC sweater at UCLA? Sorry.
I agree.
Thank you for your talk. I'm
Sorry
really,
for the
yeah, no worries.
follow-up.
It wasn't planned. I'm really connecting with the idea that this racial identity process is contextual, not only from shared colonial history perspective, but also neighborhood, academic, etc. I wonder if you got any sense from your subjects how they felt about this process taking place, whether it was favorable, whether they took pride in this, confluence of racial identities, and if they mentioned whether or not it had any impacts on mental health.
That's a great question, especially the mental health question, right? I think the mental health thing is really interesting, and that's something that when I think about this project, it's kind of like a square one for me to do other projects related to mental health. So basically, how do Filipinos, my hypothesis based on other readings, and that's all I got for you right now is hypotheses, is that Filipinos who are well versed in talking race and sort of code switching, they're gonna have the best mental health outcomes, because at any point their identity has legitimacy in that space, whether they play up whatever, Asian side, Latino side, whatever you want to call it. I think it's less a matter of like what their identity is than their relationship to the racial identity that will affect mental health outcomes. I think that Filipinos weren't necessarily conscious that they were saying like, in this space I felt this way, in that space I felt that way, with the exception of people that actually studied race, which I didn't really try to include that much. But I had one individual actually who, and it's less about mental health than it is about social support, right? Because the dynamics of identity are very multidimensional. It includes family, neighborhood, school. I had an individual who grew up in Koreatown. This is for a separate study. I just happened to ask some of the same questions. Grew up in Koreatown, went to like Korean school because that was the cool thing to do among his classmates, and had mostly Korean friends. But when interacting with their parents, there was this wall that never was let down. Lived in a working class neighborhood, mostly Latino. He could walk into a Latino neighbor's house as if it was his own and it would feel like family, right? So I think that the basis of connection is different for Filipinos when they connect with Filipinos and Asian Americans and Filipinos and Latinos. And that's something worth actually exploring more deeply. So, yes.
I was just curious.
Oh.
I know for your.
Sorry.
Did I skip? I can wait.
I'll go with. No. Go ahead.
Your study focused on middle class
Mhm.
Filipinos, and I'm wondering if you studied or if you have hypotheses about if it would be different for upper class or for working class Filipino communities.
Great question. So I have a few respondents who are working class, borderline working poor, right? And so this one young woman, Andrea, I'm trying to remember. So Andrea, not a real name, of course, it's a pseudonym. She grew up in Igorok. Parents lost their jobs and they had to move into a motel for about a year. So her sister, and her parents lived in a motel. Obviously, that narrative, very different than the other Filipinos in Igorok, even though she lived in the same neighborhood, very different narrative. Yeah, there are Filipinos that are struggling, but what they'll do is they'll just live in the same household with like 3 other families, and they won't be as struggling. But them, it was very, very different, very working poor almost. And so what this did is it deterred her opportunity to build connections with Filipinos, because they'd be like, can we go to your house? And she'd be like, no, please don't come to my house. Or, my mom's busy, you can't come. Interestingly enough, I mentioned that thing where a gentleman said, we're kind of more cool with the church-going family Latinos versus the stereotypical Cholo Latinos. This young woman, because of where she lived, which is more on the border of Igorok and the working class neighborhood, her closest friends were those stereotypically Cholo-looking Latinos, right? But of course, again, she's not one to sort of conceptualize that there was like something different going on there. You know, she wasn't thinking in a sociological way. And so she was like, yeah, Filipinos and Latinos are connected, but the basis of her connection is totally, the underlying dynamics are totally different than other Filipinos in the neighborhood. But it's a great, class makes a big deal. So, yes, Professor.
I think your research findings, I think it can be interpreted probably, in my view, more performative dimension than who they are, what they are. It's like, so I think it can be interpreted that way. But I think my question is, what about the other side? Like, when we talk about racialization, it's more than self-identification. So how Filipinos and also Latinos, they are interpellated, by various state agent or labor market, or so I think that's my first question. And then second is going beyond the individual level. Can we talk about a little bit like collectively? Like I remember, like sometimes ago, Mexican and Filipino farm workers, they formed coalitions, those things. So is there anything happening right now? So those two questions, this how they are assigned, how they are structurally treated, and interpellated by the structure in society, and then the other one is really more than individual levels, that what's going on, I mean politically or otherwise.
Yeah, to answer your second question first, because it's the one that's fresh in my mind. As Cesar noted, the 1960s changed a lot, right? What the 1960s did is that it made race a viable organizing tool for political struggle and political movement. And I think that it didn't have this race race didn't have the same level of cachet for these farm workers for a variety of reasons, and labor ended up being the uniting factor for those people. So yeah, that's a good point. And then your first question had to do with performativity. This is the part where I'm kicking myself because I didn't do ethnographic work. I did interviews, right? And I think that with respect to performativity, that's a big deal because people's racial performance varies tremendously. And I wish that there was a way to capture it in the interviews, but because I'm only with them for a set period of time and not hanging out with them, it was difficult to find. I think that if I were to ever, when I think about the next phases of this study, I think about incorporating video. And for example, I have this dream project where I want to see how people like Filipinos who are videoed, how they're assessed as job applicants. And I want to see the ones whose racial performance is like fitting stereotypical notions of highly professional, and whose racial performance are being more, I guess, like using more vernaculars and things like that. I want to see if they're racialized differently by other people that are watching these videos. That would be that's a great point about the performativity. So, should I take one more? Any other questions? Okay, Cesar.
So you used in answer to a question about race and ethnicity, race as kind of pan-ethnicities, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so we can think of the races in America as as pan-ethnicities, African Americans, all these ethnicities from Africa. They get run through the plantation. They come out at the end a race in America, whatever, a group. There's an Asian pan-ethnicity emerging in America. There's a Latino pan-ethnicity emerging in America. They're going to be called races, I think.
2020 perhaps?
Yeah, something like that. And so 40 years from now, 30 years from now, you pick, where will Filipinos be?
Oh.
Will they be in the Asian pan-ethnicity, or will they be in the Latino pan-ethnicity, or will they continue to straddle, which is what you've described today? What's assimilation like? Where will they go? I know it's a speculative question. But
yeah. I have an article that's entitled "Are Filipinos Becoming Asian or Latino?" And I realize that when you have that as your article title, people will say, "Well, what's the answer?" Right? Like yourself.
Right.
So, what I think about in the United States, particularly places like California, where Latinos are emerging to be an extremely economically and politically powerful demographic, I wonder to what extent Filipinos might start to become more and more conscious of their ability to pass, and whether they would capitalize on those particular moments of passing to become political leaders or other types of, receive other types of symbolic or material capital. So the question I asked to myself, and this is not about a child of an immigrant per se, but I always ask myself, with the case of undocumented immigration, arguably framed as a Latino issue, one of the faces of the undocumented immigrant movement is Jose Antonio Vargas. And if you go on the Huffington Post and you find anything on Jose Antonio Vargas, it's in Hispanic voices. And I wonder to what extent his name and his ability to pass has actually assisted his ability to be a leader for a political issue that's been codified as Latino. So I think about things like that happening more and more in the future.
Vargas is a Filipino.
Vargas is Filipino, yes. Yeah. So, yeah, I think I have a slant. So there's Vargas. Jose Antonio Vargas articles, Latino voices, right? And so to what extent are Filipinos that decide to be more politically active gonna catch wind that they could write the coattails of Latino political organizations? Who knows? That's a great question though. So with that, I guess that's the end, and thank you very much for all those questions.